board, if Sandy Slater ever invites you to lecture at the College of Charleston, just rest your liver for a few days in advance. But Sandy took me out Madeira tasting. She's quite fabulous.
So yeah, and Brooke, you didn't get to see our friend Eric Golinek, who is in Michigan.
Oh,
right? Made punch. Show
Okay.
Brooke.
There we go. So this is the, I'm not drinking personally out of this bowl, but
Well, why not?
It really was good. The visual culture of the Zoom, you know, is really makes this look
It looks even bigger.
like twice the size of my head. So
yeah, Eric, you had me convinced that that was a punch bowl. So,
it's, you know, formally it's a pretty good. There were glass bowls that were used in the 18th century, and they tended to look kind of have roughly this sort of form. So, you know, there you go.
wow. Wow.
Eric, Eric, may I ask a favor? If when Amy is giving her presentation, if you could, ooh, there is that another Madeira there?
Yes, I gifted my dad a bottle of Madeira.
Oh, that's your dad. Okay,
I think
all
that's
right.
the Library Company Madeira.
Awesome.
So Eric, if you have a simple recipe for punch like you were talking about,
Yeah.
if you might share that in the chat feature,
Sure.
I'm sure people would love to have that while Amy's giving her spiel.
Yeah.
Eric, what punch did you make?
I just sort of improvised out of the things that I had. It's a very adaptable drink, you know. So
You know, when I was at Powell House,
what's that?
when I was at Powell House, I used to make Fish House punch. I have a 1740s recipe card for it.
Nice.
And I was at a party once where I was seated across from the late Jimmy Biddle. Did any of you know Jimmy? And Jimmy, are any of you related to Jimmy Biddle?
I don't think we have any Biddles on the phone call.
Or perhaps his lawyer, because Jimmy, the host said, "Oh, Jimmy, you would love George's parties. He makes delicious Fish House punch." And Biddle said, "You know, Grandmama always made Fish House punch for Christmas Eve dinner, but she thought it was a little bland, so she'd finish it with a cup of gin."
That sounds like a drink at Andalusia to me.
It, you know, I never drank at Andalusia. I was not in the Speedo set, but.
So I think Abby is going to probably take over from us.
I am, yes. I was like, that's a great transition to start the program. And I want to start the program with a toast to thank all of you so much for taking the time out of your quarantine to spend it with us. Cheers, all of you. I'd love to see.
Wait,
Huzzah!
you're supposed to hold these with your pinky out, right? Is that how David Hancock taught me?
Well, so cheers, everyone. Take a drink.
Cheers.
Cheers.
So before I turn it over to our wonderful speakers today, I do want to just go over some Zoom housekeeping, because for many of us, this is something we've done a lot recently, myself included, but for some of us, I know this might be your first time. So I'm going to quickly just go over how to make this the most enjoyable experience for you to have over Zoom. And I'm going to start by first muting everybody. Thank you. So just some Zoom basics. Number one, to go over, Zoom has basically two different configurations that you can see everyone. So its default is speaker view. So that's probably what you're on. If I'm the giant head at the bottom of your screen, that means you're on speaker view. That's what I'm going to recommend you stay in for at least the beginning portion of the talk. So Anna is going to be speaking first, I believe. And so that way you'll see her large. And then once it becomes more of a dialogue, and we do want to open it up to questions and have part of this be a conversation, you can switch it over to the other view, which is if you go to the top right-hand corner, you'll see these little squares lined up. You'll click on that and it says gallery view, and that will switch you over where you will see lots of faces. So I just did that, and you all look like the cast of the Brady Bunch for me. But you can click which one you want. Your screen will look however it looks. It doesn't impact anyone else. The other thing to mention is I just muted everyone, but you can unmute yourself. I'm going to ask, just for respect, respecting everybody that you stay muted unless you're speaking. So the reason I do that is because Zoom tries to assume who it thinks is the speaker. So if you say have a cat with you and they come over, like Monica's cat, which is in the screen, they come over, they're a little bit chatty. If you're not on mute, the screen is going to cut away from our speakers and go straight to your cat, which is really enjoyable and cute. But for this, I'm going to ask that you stay on mute unless you're actively speaking. The other thing that you can mute if you'd like is your camera. So everybody was muted camera-wise and your microphone just to start. But if you'd like to unmute your camera and you're muted, you just go to the bottom of your screen, click what looks like the camera icon, a square with another little triangle, and that will unmute your camera. So it's up to you. It's up to you to, I just fritzed for a second, sorry. It's up to you to make that choice. If you'd like to hang out in your PJs and not have your camera on, you're more than welcome. I also mentioned that because we are recording tonight's event. We have people maybe that couldn't be here tonight for Jewish holidays or other celebrations. And so we want to make sure that we have a recording of this to share with our audience later. But if you don't want to be on film or on video, you're welcome to not have your camera on. The only people who will be included in the camera are also the people who are speaking as well, if that helps too. Other than that, so we do want this to be discussion based towards the end of the program. They have a lovely slideshow to share with you, but once they open it up to questions, you can ask questions in 2 different ways. So the first one is you can type something in the chat function, which I'm going to do now. So feel free to use this function throughout the whole talk. I know Anna already mentioned the gentleman who made punch. If you want to share your recipe, feel free to throw that in the chat function there. We have many people that share links for different scholarship or just comments in general. Feel free to blow up the chat. And then the other option is you can raise your hand virtually. So this is so since we can't see each other in real space, you can virtually raise your hand. And the way you do that is go to the bottom of your screen. Awesome. Where it says participants, you'll click on that. And then under your name or under the list of names, you'll see the raise hand function. So that way we'll be able to see you and we'll be able to call on you that way. So when we get to the Q&A portion, you can either raise your hand virtually and we'll get to you, or you can put your question in chat if you don't want to say it out loud. That's also something. Thank you already for the really nice feedback. The last thing I want to mention is if you have any questions, any technical difficulties, and you need to reach someone, you can chat me directly. My name is Abby King, or you can also message me. This goes for future programs as well. We have a lot of really wonderful programs each week. Just next week, if I can do a really quick plug, we have a program next Tuesday night on dogs in PAFA's collection. So if I have any dog lovers who want to bring their dogs and talk about dogs and art, I see some hands, please feel free to check those out on our website, and you can email me if you have questions. And I'm going to put my email address in the chat too. Multitasking. All right. So that's enough of me talking. It's now my pleasure to hand you over to our speakers. We have the Curator of Historical American Art, Anna Marley, and she is joined by Art Historian Amy Henderson. So welcome and cheers to you both and to everybody here for joining us. Unmute yourself, please.
Okay. I'm going to unmute myself, and I'm just going to echo Abby's welcome. And I want to just tell you how we're going to do things to get started. I have Amy here, and we have a great group of 18th century lovers on this chat. We also have another really special guest that I'm really excited is here with us, Reverend Mark Tyler from Mother Bethel Church. I'm really excited that he has joined us tonight, and I want to make sure that Amy and I give him a little time to talk about Reverend Allen and Absalom Jones and their important role in the yellow fever epidemic. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Amy. I'm going to introduce what we're talking about, yellow fever. Amy's going to talk and show us some of the elite homes of Philadelphia and talk about her scholarship on the Republican Court in Philadelphia. And then I'm going to put up a few slides of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and Benjamin Rush. And I'm going to ask Reverend Tyler to say a few words since he knows so much about their leadership role during the yellow fever epidemic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen with a PowerPoint that Amy and I have worked on together, and I'm going to introduce Amy to you all. So let's get the images up there. All right. Okay. Abby, does that look good to you?
That
Yep.
looks great. That looks
Great. Okay.
Yep.
So tonight, our PAFA Pours is Toasts in the Era of Yellow Fever. And our guest tonight is Dr. Amy Henderson. Amy is joining us from Washington, D.C. And Amy has done some programming with PAFA in the past before. We had a wonderful event a few years ago now where she hosted a group had to have an 18th century dinner at the Powell House. So I thought, given that we are in a situation in Philadelphia now that in many ways is strikingly similar to the yellow fever epidemic of the 1790s, that I would ask Amy to lead us through a conversation about what it was like being confined to your home or not, as the case may be, in the 1790s in Philadelphia. So I'll mention a bit about Amy, and then I will say one thing about one piece in our collection that really inspired me to think about this talk. So Amy is a art historian and a scholar of material culture, and her most recent publication, which I think is in the background of her, but behind her drinks, is French and Fashionable, The Search for George and Martha Washington's French Furniture, which just came out in American Furniture. And she is currently revising a book based on her dissertation. It's under contract with Oxford University Press, and the title is called Furnishing the Republic, Material Culture, Gender, and Politics in the Nation's Capital, 1789 to 1800. And for those of you who don't know, the nation's capital was Philadelphia. And so that's one of the reasons we're talking about it tonight. What I'm showing you here is an image from Amy's brief moment of TV glory, which is she was the featured historian for an episode of Chef Walter Stabe's PBS cooking series, A Taste of History. And the subject was Eliza Powell's Sinful Feast. So when Amy's not writing or researching or making COVID-19 masks, which she's doing right now, she works part-time at Mount Vernon, George Washington's Mount Vernon, as a research associate. So I'm really looking forward to what Amy is going to share with us. And I just want to share with you guys before Amy gets started, this painting that has always really touched me in our collection. It's by Joseph Wright. And you will see that the painting is dated 1793, which was also the year of Joseph Wright's death. And this painting is actually unfinished. So there are slight areas that you can see if you look. The young boy's face is very highly delineated, but the young child on the lower left is kind of a little sketchy. The reason for that is that Joseph Wright and his wife were both killed in the yellow fever epidemic, and they left their children orphans. So I think all of us today who are thinking about families who are losing people, about children who cannot be with their parents, this is just an amazingly evocative painting that really takes you back to that moment in Philadelphia in the 1790s. And just a little statistic about the yellow fever epidemic, particularly in 1793. Philadelphia was not only the capital city, but it was the largest city in the United States with a population of 50,000. And so in the yellow fever epidemic, 10% of the population died. So just thinking about that, like 10% of your city dying, it was a remarkably large proportion of the city of Philadelphia, and it had a really huge impact. Joseph Wright was a member, a peripheral member in a way of the Republican court that Amy's going to talk about. He was connected with Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin, as well as the Powells. And he was about to start a government position at the US Mint when he was killed. So without further ado, I'm going to let Amy take over, and she's going to talk for a little while, and then we are going to unmute Reverend Tyler, because I know he has to leave maybe around 6 o'clock. So Amy, take it over.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I'm going to let you go to the first slide. There we go. So as Anna mentioned, my specialty is this little 10-year period, the 1790s in Philadelphia. And my passion is telling the stories about women in this time period. And I do that predominantly through houses and any kind of decorative objects inside the house. I find that's a really good way to try and access the lives of women, which have really been left out of predominant history books, unfortunately. And also because of the type of materials that I rely on, the perspective that I can bring to this conversation is about the very wealthy members of Philadelphia society, upper middle class, or we would call them the elites in that time period. They had the money to buy these houses, to furnish these houses, the leisure time to study and read and write, and that just happens to be how I focus my time. Samuel and Elizabeth Powell are a wonderful way, a lens to look at this time period. And you can see in that first slide, there's, I'm like throwing my mouse around, and I suppose you can't see my mouse. In the very center is the facade of the house, and then two views of the parlors on the second story. On the left, you have a picture of Elizabeth Powell from the 1780s, and down below is a portrait of Samuel Powell from the 1760s. And they were a power couple like no other in Philadelphia. They were at the center of the American Revolution, of colonial time period. Samuel was the last mayor of colonial Philadelphia, the first mayor of post-revolutionary Philadelphia, and his wife Elizabeth was one of the leading lights of Philadelphia society, and she was a Willing by birth, and they're also a very distinguished, wealthy family. I have so many quotes and so little time to share it all with you, but I will see how many I can get to. This is one of my absolute favorite that describes the Powells and their relationship. It's from 1782 from a French military officer. And he wrote, "It would be difficult to separate two persons who have for 20 years lived together in happiest union. I shall not say as man and wife, which would not an American convey the idea of perfect equality, but as two friends unusually well matched in understanding, taste, and knowledge. Mr. Powell has traveled widely in Europe and brought back from there a taste for the fine arts. His house is adorned with valuable prints and good copies of his several Italian paintings. Mrs. Powell has not traveled, but she has read a good deal and profitably. What chiefly distinguishes her from most other ladies is her taste for conversation and the truly European manner in which she uses her wit and knowledge." And I just love that. I think it sums up who they were as a couple. She was noted for her erudition and her ability with literature and history and politics. They entertained all of the who's who of federal Philadelphia. They were very good friends with George and Martha Washington. And in their house, you would have politicians as well as lawyers and physicians and educators and musicians, and everybody was in and out of the Powell's house. One of the important things we need to keep in mind about houses in this time period is that historians no longer think of the house, domestic architecture, as a space just for women, as a separate sphere. But really, we look at the parlors and the dining rooms as spaces of heterosociability, where men and women come together to interact. And so increasingly, we think about the house as a place where politics were taking place. I have another great quote from Abigail Adams, who learned the importance of social activities in these houses. And she wrote, while she and John were in France, when he was being minister at the end of the American Revolution, more is to be performed by way of negotiation many times, at one of these entertainments than at 20 serious conversations. And women were, end quote, and women were very much part of those conversations. So we look at a house like the Powells, we think about their choices in marble mantles and the carvings, the mahogany doors, the paintings on the wall, the beautiful furniture. These were all symbols of who they were as a couple. And, you know, they were important materials for the part of what we call polite sociability or political sociability. Okay, Anna, next slide.
All right.
So I wanted to give you a map of Philadelphia, and although it might be a little hard to see, you can see little arrows showing you where the different houses were. And I just picked out, I guess, 6 different houses here. The Washington on the very top, that was the presidential mansion. Then you've got Pierce Butler, who was a very wealthy senator from Georgia, and he was a Federalist. Then he becomes a Democratic Republican. Robert and Mary Morris's house, that was probably the largest singles house in Philadelphia, although it was an incomplete. Henry Hill's house is on the bottom. That's one I've done a lot of work on. And the Hill House, the Powell House are both extant today in Historic House Museums, so you can visit them. And if you just also kind of put this in your mind, on the right-hand side of the map, just inland from Powell and the Bingham mansions, that is the wharf. That's the Delaware River. And the yellow fever epidemic is going to begin in the wharf, just kind of north of where the Powell House is. And the Powell and the Bingham houses and those families are actually not that far off from where the worst part of the epidemic is going to take place. So these houses, and what I'm always looking at in terms of their exterior and interior ornamentation is how do they communicate something about a person's taste and refinement and knowledge and virtue. And I use these houses as, you know, as an extra vocabulary, and as I believe the people in the 18th century did, because they wanted to communicate something about their belief system through their material choices. Next slide, Anna. So Anna wanted to talk about country houses. I know very little about country houses, although I've done a nice little deep dive into it. And here is a map, and you can see the majority of the country houses, their names are illustrated in red. They're not that far outside of the city of Philadelphia. I know that Laura Keim is lurking somewhere in our talk today. There's Stenton. Clifton is another wonderful historic house museum. Anna lives just a little bit north of those properties. And I just illustrated 2 particular houses on the slide. You've got the Bingham's Mansion, which was the most impressive house in federal Philadelphia at that time period. And then they owned a country house, Lansdowne. From the time Philadelphia or Pennsylvania was founded in the 1780s, there was a desire for owners to be able to connect with nature. And William Penn was very keen on people having access to nature. There's a huge building boom in the 1730s to the 1760s, and wealthy families who did create these estates, big farms, and landed estates outside of the city. And this just gives you a sense of some of those principal properties.
Amy, can I ask you a quick question?
Yep.
About these? So during the yellow fever epidemic, would most of these families have gone to these houses that were outside the city?
Yes, they did. The Binghams, interestingly, had another outside house or property in New Jersey. And so they were not at Lansdowne during the epidemic. They were a little bit further away. But yes, and by contemporary accounts, 20,000 Philadelphians fled the city and to get out of Dodge, essentially. There's this one really good quote. This was from Matthew Carey, who was a newspaper editor, and he wrote and said right after the epidemic in October or November of that year, so great was the general terror that for some weeks, carts, wagons, coaches, and riding chairs were almost constantly transporting families and furniture to the country in every direction. Now, there was a strong town and country culture among the families that I study. And so I think it's plausible that a lot of them were already in this, like wives and children were already in the city. But unlike England, where you have a slightly different landed estate experience, in Philadelphia, the majority of power and wealth came from merchants and their counting houses and shipping industry. And so people like Samuel Powell and William Bingham, they were going back into the city to check on their properties, to check on their businesses during the epidemic. And as a result, several of these leading lights did get sick with the yellow fever. Before the government, so by September, the yellow fever is pretty much shut down the national, the regional, state government. There's only one elected official who is still working in Philadelphia, and that's Mayor Matthew Clarkson. Everyone else has fled. The Washingtons, they leave September 9th. They invite Elizabeth Powell to go with them to Mount Vernon, but she says, no, I'm going to stay because our friend, Dr. Rush, he is probably the physician who knows best how to manage the yellow fever. And she also was anxious that were her husband Samuel to get yellow fever, she wanted to be available to help take care of him and be with him. Tragically, however, he does die of the yellow fever, I think around September 29th of that year, and he did expire without friends and family nearby.
Can I show the next slide, Amy? Maybe.
Yeah, you take it, Anna.
Well, I just wanted to, you were talking about him expiring alone, and I wondered, I wanted to show the dead house while you were talking about that.
So we don't exactly know, maybe George or Laura, one of our other historians of the 18th century, know what the dead house was used. I suspect it was a gathering place for bodies. But Samuel happened to die on in a farmhouse on his country estate, which is kind of, I think it was probably near what is University of Pennsylvania today. George can probably weigh in on that later.
It is. It's the area of West Philadelphia that we still call Powelton.
Yeah.
The nephew tore it down in the early 19th century and built quite a majestic house. And as far as I've ever been able to figure out, all that was devastated. There's not a scrap of unless
we can talk about that. We can talk about that in a minute, George. And so Samuel passes away tragically by himself, and Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a very well-respected physician in this time period, he was convinced that he had figured out what the cure was, how to treat the patients. Unfortunately, that involved bloodletting and purging. And as historians like to point out, that if you didn't die of the yellow fever, you're going to die of Dr. Benjamin Rush's treatment with the yellow fever. And also, quite sadly, as we think about contrast between 1793 and today, the government was not prepared for this type of epidemic on this scale. And even Benjamin Rush, after he came up with his kind of regimen, he's quoted as saying that the yellow fever was so easy to treat, it was no more than a common cold. And of course, we know that was not the case. Anna, do you want to say more or bring in Reverend Tyler to talk a little bit about, how Philadelphia and Philadelphians got through the epidemic with the help of African Americans?
Yeah, I think Bush, showing Bush Hill, which was a country estate that also served as a hospital, where there were so it's sort of major field hospital, So now here in Philadelphia, we're taking over, Temple University stadiums. This was a sort of reappropriation. And from our map before, you saw that Bush Hill was actually the closest estate to the city. But yeah, I would love it if, and just the one thing I wanted to point out on this slide before we get to Reverend Tyler is the Arch Street Ferry and this beautiful miniature that is about this big in our collection. And we wanted to show these because we wanted to show you where yellow fever came from and how it entered the city. And it came from ships that we think came from what is now Haiti, Saint Domingue, and the Arch Street docks was the place of origin. So our friend Benjamin Rush, and I mean, yes, Benjamin Rush here, depicted by his cousin, William Rush, actually reached out to the African-American community, particularly to Reverend Richard Allen and to Absalom Jones. And I wonder if Reverend Tyler can unmute himself and talk a little bit from his perspective as the current leader of Mother Bethel Church about the really important role that Richard Allen and Absalom Jones played in helping the city of Philadelphia.
Sure, thank you. And this is really fascinating. I have been talking about this quite a bit lately. In fact, I preached when the shutdown started. The first sermon I preached maybe 3 weeks ago was lessons from the yellow fever. Last night, I led a Bible study group with a congregation by Zoom in Bermuda, an AME church there that was also interested in the same kind of conversation we're having now. And so people are really looking back at this time, trying to, make some sense of it. And this is about the closest thing that we know. So thank you again for the setup. And I do have some extra time. So I'll just say I have a few things and I can kind of hang back and let the presentation finish as well. Great. If that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. And also, I don't know if you want to, but somebody has requested that you turn your video on, but yeah. You don't have to.
I'll turn it on in a second. I'm driving now. We had a minor thing at the church that I had to run down to take care of. So as soon as I finish that, yeah, we'll do. So, so Benjamin Rush, reached out to Black Philadelphians because of the myth of Black immunity around yellow fever, which ultimately ended up not being true. And as a result, many African Americans ended up very sick and also dying as well. And in fact, Richard Allen, according to Richard Newman, whose book you should probably also get, spent almost 2 months in the hospital as well. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, pull over now, I think I'm good now. And so Richard Allen himself almost died as a result of yellow fever as well. Can you guys see me now?
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
So in spite of the fact that Blacks found out that they were not immune, they continued to serve and continued to serve as nurses to the sick, and primarily as those who carried the dead to be buried as well. And I'm interested, so hopefully one of the other historians can help me identify closer where the Bush Hill Hospital actually was. It's such a large tract of land. I drove through kind of the general area yesterday trying to get a feel for it. But I've just been struck by just all of the similarities in this moment. Mm-hmm. So in today's world, now it's not persons like Benjamin Rush, who, by the way, went to his grave. One of the greatest regrets ever was, being wrong about Black immunity, something he never really was able to get over. But today, that myth is continually perpetrated, and now it's, unfortunately, hitting the Black community in the reverse way. So if you look at the numbers around the country and the ways in which this disease today is disproportionately taking a toll on the Black community, a lot of it is because I've had even family members say, that this disease, when it first started, cannot, hurt Black people. And just, you almost could take the language verbatim from 1793 and insert it today. And so the ways in which these myths and these mistruths kind of take a life of their own and continue to have deadly consequences. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is, that was touched on earlier, the idea that, privilege, had its place then, and it does now as well. So if you were privileged enough to have a house outside of the city, you could travel away, you could get away. And so, many of us are complaining today about, all of the Zoom meetings. I don't know about you, but we're all being Zoomed to death. And, but the fact that we have a place to shelter in, mm-hmm. The fact that many of us are salaried, and so whether or not we go into the office or not, there's a check that continues to come in. Our children don't have to worry about food. We have high-speed internet connection and everything else that continues to keep us connected, that it is actually a privilege to shelter in place. because in today's society, there are a number of people where home is the least safe place for them. And so, you know, I kind of feel that we're going to hear those kind of stories on the other side of this pandemic. Also, the idea in the ways in which it brought the best out in people and the worst out in people. I would encourage you to take a look at Richard Allen's autobiography, which is available online. It's available for free at the Documenting the American South. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones published their account of what happened as a result of being accused by a guy named Matthew Carey, who fled the city and came back and said that they were charging high rates to whites for nursing them and stealing from the dead. So they wrote a very detailed account, and it's chilling, but it brings out some of the best stories of humanity, the ways in which people went above and beyond for their neighbors. And at the same time, it also pointed out some of the most cruel things and the way in which fear makes us turn on each other quickly. I mean, because again, this happened so fast. And so people who were neighborly yesterday were wishing for the death of neighbors the very next day. And so the final thing that I'll just say about this, and again, I'm happy to take questions toward the end as well, Anna, is the idea around who is essential, right? Prior to this, you know, free Black persons and enslaved Black persons in, you know, 18th century Philadelphia were not viewed as an essential part of society. The reason Richard Allen and Absalom Jones are starting their own churches is because they left St. George's Methodist Church due to segregation that had been imposed, right? So, you know, white worshipers wanted them there, but not on equal terms. And so, you know, Black folk there were trying to find their way and trying to prove that they were an essential part of the this emerging nation, had not been viewed that way. And yet, when the chips were down, the people that they turned to were these quote unquote non-essential people became essential. Mm-hmm. And so likewise today, I mean, we're quick to cite, rightfully so, the medical workers, doctors, nurses, people who keep hospitals open, fire, rescue, police. But, you know, who knew that the $7 an hour grocery clerk or the $7.25 an hour person who works in fast food or, you know, these restaurants to keep food on the table and keep society moving for us is actually an essential person. And so my hope in trying to continue that Richard Allen legacy is on the other side, we'll begin to compensate people for the essential role that they play, because I don't know anyone today who would dispute the fact that these persons are every bit as heroic, showing up to work in a grocery store every day in this pandemic. I mean, my hat is off to you. And so those are just some of the reflections that I have in this moment, looking back then and now.
Thank you so much, Mark. That, you know, we didn't talk about what we were going to say, but that was exactly what I was hoping you would talk about. And I think you and I follow you on Facebook, so I know some of the things you've been preaching, and I know some of the same articles we've been reading about essential workers and the luxury of being able to work from home. And one thing I thought about with the leadership of Absalom Jones and Richard Allen was, you know, why they chose to heed Benjamin Rush's call, what they thought they could do for their community by doing this. And it seems to me like it's happened over and over again in African-American history. It happens again in World War I when so many African-Americans volunteer to serve in World War I, and then they come back and they are not given the same rights that their fellow soldiers were. So, you know, and that's why I'm showing you here this this narrative that Reverend Tyler mentioned, which Absalom Jones and Reverend Allen wrote to basically clear their name after Matthew Carey's spurious accusations of, frankly, their heroic work. And it's not that different from people today saying, well, why are you all going on the subways? Why are you people all going to work? Why aren't you staying at home, right? Like, it's a luxury. So I do want to, Amy and I have one more slide to show, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. And the reason Amy and I are showing this slide of the Schuylkill River, I'm drinking my Schuylkill River Trail Ale, is we wanted to show, oops, did it just go away? Okay, there it is. we're in a really dark place right now, and we're going to have probably a deep discussion, but we did want to talk about sometimes some of the good things that come out of tragedies like yellow fever. And in the case of Philadelphia, it created the first public waterworks in the country. And actually, they didn't realize that yellow fever was caused by mosquitoes. So we created this clean water system that was of major health benefit to the city. So something Amy and I were thinking about is like, we don't know what good things are going to come out of this horrible moment that we're in right now. But we do know about human ingenuity and survival. And so we wanted to end with this image and then open it up for discussion.
And do you want me to do the Henry Hill quote?
Yes.
Okay.
Amy has a toast that she would like to share with us.
So not only did Samuel Powell perish in the 1793 epidemic, but one of my other founding fathers, well, he's not really founder, but he's an important guy in my history life, Henry Hill, and I showed you his house at the very beginning. He died in the 1798 reprisal of the yellow fever epidemic. And he was a big Madeira wine importer. Probably his company had probably the biggest company in colonial America. And somebody wrote a poem a couple years after he passed away, and part of it goes, now everyone get your glass ready.
Here we go.
Now stir the fire and bring the wine. 'Twas bottled anno 99 and bought of Harry Hill. Pour out a bumper. Here's a toast to those on earth we love the most and those who love us still. Let's drink to history and to our knowledge of history.
Huzzah.
Huzzah.
Huzzah! We should probably explain to the non-18th century nerds here what this huzzah thing is.
Aren't we all 18th century nerds?
No.
No!
Oh, hi,
I was
Heather.
going to say, I raised my hand because I want you to tell me what I'm supposed to be drinking in the 1790s.
Okay.
Not the water.
Everything.
Not the water.
Currently, I'm very pleased with my boxed wine, but I would really like to know what it's supposed to be.
I don't think there's a supposed to be. If you were Samuel and Elizabeth Powell or Henry Hill or the people I study, you would be drinking wine, probably also beer. Where's Laura Kine? You can probably address that. But Madeira was the single biggest wine import. It was the beverage of choice of distinguished gentlemen. I presume women drank it too, although I'm not positive about that. And it came from the island of Madeira, much like it does today. And it was popular up and down the eastern seaboard.
And Amy, who would have been drinking beer?
Well, I think everybody would have been drinking beer as well, and drinking beer instead of wine, or instead of water.
Instead of water, right.
Yeah.
Anna, in your defense, first of all, Anna's a Canadian, so we have to make some allowances. But also remember when John Adams arrived in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, he wrote to Abigail saying, the beer here was so light and fresh and delicious, he was having it for breakfast instead of hard cider.
Mm.
I think Laura wanted to say something.
Oh, I was just, George kind of brought it up anyway. I was going to bring up cider
Hi,
too,
Laura.
that one of the main reasons for having fruit trees, particularly apples, was also to put up a stock of cider.
Another good reason to have a country house, because then you could have an orchard and produce your own cider.
Did the Logans grow apples, Laura?
They did, yeah.
And do we have a knowledge of a cider press or?
There was a mill, and there's some thought that it was, in fact, a cider mill. So.
Some people might not know who the Logans are. Laura, or could you mention, because you were on that map that we showed, like where you work
right.
and where it's located in the city.
So my name's Laura Kime, and I actually went to school with Amy way back when, but I'm a curator at Stenton, which is a historic site in the lower northwest part of the city, and in the Logan neighborhood just outside of Germantown. And it was a 511-acre plantation, a house completed in 1730, And it's been run as a historic house museum by the National Society of Colonial Dames in Pennsylvania since 1899.
So there's a question here that Janet Smith asked, why was it called yellow fever?
Yeah, and I think I saw the answer looks correct to me, that it has to do, I think, with the disease somehow attacking the liver.
Yes.
And causing jaundice. So people literally looked yellow, the whites of their eyes looked yellow.
And it was horrible. You actually, at the late stage, you started vomiting up black
Blood.
bile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another fun fact I learned about the yellow fever, if there can be fun facts, is that, and it, again, parallels with COVID-19, is for some reason, some people, either they reacted to it not so badly. And so when Dr. Rush would treat somebody and they survived his cure, it was more likely they were going to survive no matter what. That if you got it badly, you were toast. But if you just got a little bit, you were going to survive. You had a very good chance of survival. So Alexander Hamilton, his wife got it, and they survived. Elizabeth Powell's brother, Thomas Willing, he got it, he survived. So there were of course survivals.
And we actually had a chime in from the other Dr. Henderson, who is a medical doctor, and who said that we are correct. Monica is correct in her assessment of yellow fever. So, questions from our group here. Anybody want to raise their hand and ask a question? Or make a comment?
We have one in the chat box from Janet who asked if you could talk about Powelton Village some more.
I would kick that to George.
Yeah, let's unmute George for that.
Ooh, I'm becoming so technological. I just unmuted again. I don't know a lot about it. It is where Samuel Powell died. And like a lot of people who lived in city houses, the Powells, who were tremendously wealthy, owned country land. Part of that was investment, and part of that was it was your version of BJ's or Costco. They would have, that's where they would have kept the cattle or kept, probably egg-producing chickens or horses, etc. We know Samuel Powell went, and there is, I think, one image, and it's not terribly detailed, from what the first Powelton house looked like. Powelton now is essentially the fraternity area next to Drexel University in West Philadelphia. But as far as I've ever been able to tell, and I haven't really worked on this since I directed Powell House a very long time ago now, it essentially, with the age of the railroad and suburbanization, everything that was Samuel Powell's is gone. I don't even think there's anything surviving archaeologically. I could be wrong on that. In Philadelphia, every time you dig a basement, you hit somebody. But and that was what it was. When he got sick, he went to what was supposed to be the cleaner air of the country. They thought that it was bad smells or something. A lot of the initial cases were that the sickness was being caused by a batch of rancid coffee that had been left to rot on the dock very near where Elfers Alley is now. But Powell, of course, you can't quite imagine what Philadelphia would smell like in July 1793 in a good year. Imagine what it would have been with bodies being left to rot, people vomiting, other bad, icky stuff. That I was raised in Indiana. We don't talk about this over drinks.
So I see that we have 2 raised hands, Abby.
Yes. Do you want to go with Mark? I can unmute him now and lower.
Great, thank you very much. So yeah, I'm just asking, I wanted to ask about Bush Hill and where the makeshift hospital would have actually been. Can somebody kind of talk, from what I understand, the estate was what, 12th to 19th, Vine to Fairmount. And so just trying to get a sense of where was it?
Does Laura well, I guess if you know where it was exactly, Laura, Carrie, George, answer?
My understanding is it was almost exactly where the current Community College of Philadelphia, the old Mint building, is. Is Carrie Dethorne still on? Because she might have looked into this more recently than I have.
He has actually a raised hand. So should we let Carrie, maybe Carrie knows the answer to that
I
question.
can't find her on the screen, but.
She's hiding.
I'm here.
Hello, Carrie. Hello, Chief Curator.
Hello. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer. I have heard what you just said, George, about the former community college, and I think that's about the closest we can get. The road parameter has changed somewhat, so it's not always easy to figure out where was the front of some structure. But George, I think you're right about that.
Carrie, did you want to ask another question?
I did. I have a question for Amy and maybe Laura Keim, and that is, today, you know, we're hearing so much about small businesses and the economic impacts of COVID. I'm wondering if we know anything about 18th century craftspeople and what happened to their businesses. I mean, if they were able to leave the city, if they could afford it and had a place to go, did they have anything to come back to? I mean, what kind of economic recovery did the 18th century Philadelphia artisan community experience?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. I don't have an immediate answer, but I would refer anyone, I didn't get a chance to read the whole study, but Billy G. Smith, who's a fantastic historian, he has an entire study on the 1793, an entire book on the 1793 yellow fever epidemic. And I wouldn't be surprised if he mentions it. So that's certainly a good resource to explore. I know that we need to be careful in how we talk about Matthew Carey, who I mentioned, and I quoted, he was the one who pointed out that, and if you had a carriage or a wheeled vehicle, you got out of Dodge, you could. He's also the one who criticized the African-American community for the way that they helped take care of everybody, which was completely unfounded and unfair. But it's available online, so you look at the original document. He has an account published in one of the newspapers in October, and then a full detailed account, 119 pages, that gets published in November of that year. And interesting, Martha Washington purchased a copy of that in January of 1794, which I thought was interesting too. But Carrie, he does lay out the complete malfunction and breakdown on government and society. And I think there is a reference to the difficulties of restarting the economy in 1793. And there's also some interesting comments Martha Washington shares. So they come back from Mount Vernon in October, but first they stay outside the city in one of the country houses. I think it's in the Deschler Morris mansion. Is that right? Laura, nod your head. Mm-hmm. And then by early December, maybe December 10th, they've moved back into Philadelphia. Another interesting thing I learned is that New Yorkers, they immediately started to plant this seed that Philadelphia was destroyed, there'd be no economy, no one would want to go back, and they tried to woo the federal government back up to Manhattan. And then the Philadelphians were like, don't you dare. You know, we've got the capital for 10 years, don't even think about it. But a lot of that had to do with the economy. And then Martha Washington notes in January, February, she's writing back to her nieces in Virginia, how the social season had not quite recovered, that the theater was shut, there were no plays, no dancing assembly, all of that was closed. Everyone was still wearing black and in mourning. And so on the one hand, you know, you look at the elites that I study and it seems somewhat frivolous, but without, just like now, without those activities, you don't have the trickle down of the economy. And so it makes you wonder again, Carrie, how long there was kind of a standstill in the hairdressers, confectioners, were people going back to dinner parties as usual and supporting, you know, a whole world of people who made things and provided services. So I don't know, maybe Laura, someone else has more to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about the end of the 1793 epidemic kind of coinciding with the uptick in French immigration. And, you know, a lot of those French artisans and sort of social climbers, I think, are filling a void, particularly in the food service industry. So that might have, I've never statistically studied that, but I wonder if that might actually be true. It seems to be more than just a coincidence.
Mm-hmm. I'd have to do more reading into it.
Yeah, I'm cognizant too, just that we have a couple more minutes and we have 2 hands I'd like us to get to, and then a question in the chat box. But maybe I saw Monica's hand first, and then we can go to what I think is our furthest away person here as well. So maybe Monica, if you want to.
Sure. Although I'm awkwardly queuing up somebody else on here because I'm like very obsessed and interested in staying in this area of toasts and drinking because it's happy hour and I've had a glass of wine. And I know that Kristen Qualls is on this program, and she is the director of collections and exhibitions at Wheaton Glass. And I saw somebody earlier like bragging about what they were drinking, but maybe also what it was in, like the vessel.
The punch bowl, Eric.
The punch bowl. And I want to know from Kristen what type of glassware I would have been drinking my Madeira or my drink out of in the time of yellow fever.
Hello. In 1793, most of the glassware would have been coming over from Europe, largely from England, France, and Belgium, which would have been the major glass producers there. In America, we were still making largely bottles and functional ware. We had in 1790 is really when we just started advancing our glass manufacturing base. As far as what specifically you'd be drinking out of, the Madeira would probably come in a darker bottle because they felt that the dark green of a bottle that comes from the iron in the glass would help preserve the beverage inside of it. So it might have even been a case bottle, so a kind of square bottle, because then it would have easily fit into a case that could have been shipped over. As I mentioned, Madeira is from an island, so they would have had to ship that to us. And then I see some people have those really very cute little glasses, kind of triangular, very small, and that probably would have been the type of glass that you would have used, that would have been hand formed. The glass press wasn't invented until 1825, so at that time they still would have been using the same techniques to make the glass that they were from the ancient times. That answer your question?
Yeah. Abby, you said we had
That's
one
awesome.
question.
I never knew that.
You said we had a question from far away.
We do. I believe, is that Verena with your hand raised? Your name is a little, I'm going to unmute you.
Well, thank you. Hello, I'm dialing in from Mangrove Mountain on the central coast of New South Wales in Australia. So I'm very excited to be learning so much about Philadelphia history, and just wanted to quickly say thank you to Amy and Anna for what a fabulous insight into the privileged class and how they coped with yellow fever. So my question is to Reverend Taylor, and just wondered if you could share a little bit about your insights from, is it Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, just quickly as to how that the yellow fever impacted on that very different, I imagine a very different community and a very different experience of yellow fever. Just really quickly, because I know nothing about this, and so it really piqued my interest.
Sure, thanks. So depending on who you speak to, either in 1787 or 1792, a group of Black worshipers walked out of the predominantly white St. George's Methodist Church due to being introduced to segregated pews. So in 1793, they were well on their way toward building the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. And once that building was done, they would then help Richard Allen build what the church that I pastor now, Mother Bethel AME Church. And so the work of the churches being built was interrupted by yellow fever. So they would not have these churches built for another summer. I think someone asked the question about why would they do it. People have often said that, Black folk were trying to prove themselves in this moment and thought that if they could demonstrate by being of service to the nation when it needed it most, that a lot of the prejudice that they were experiencing would be washed away. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. It's kind of been that same attitude whenever there's been a big crisis, as Anna alluded to, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, you kind of name it. And yet it's so much a part of our country that many people kind of abandon thinking that you could kind of win, whites over who don't particularly care for you by risking your life and limb. But it devastated the community. And again, very few had the resources to get out. Ironically, Richard Allen was one who had the resources to leave, but chose to stay.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's a good segue too, while we have you, and Anna, maybe you want to chime in on this one too, but we have a question in the chat function that asks how the myth about Black resistance got started in the 18th century. And so how that myth might be related to the COVID myth now, since we know there's a lot of spreading of misinformation, but how did the myth of Black people not being resistant start?
Please go ahead.
Well, what I had read is, that Benjamin Rush actually thought that because many Blacks from Africa had resistance to malaria, that they may also have resistance to yellow fever. How about you, Reverend Tyler?
Yeah, so my suspicion is, like today with COVID-19, as they say, once you get it, you can't get it again. That because of where it came from and kind of the slave routes through the Caribbean, that Rush probably had encountered Blacks who may not have even known they had it before, or built up this resistance to it. That's very specific thing. But yeah, so again, myths have a way of taking on their own lives. And I mean, you would not believe the conversations I've had with people today in this era who will argue you up and down that no, Black people are absolutely immune to it, and that this is just a government lie, and you can't believe it, you can't get it. It's actually 5G. That's the new thing. Have you guys heard that? That's a trending myth, at least in my community, that this is actually all about the government trying to install 5G networks, and that nobody's really dying of it. So
yes, we've heard the 5G theory.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So, Reverend Tyler, when you say, are you hearing from your constituents or people in the Black community who are saying we can't get it, or are you hearing from white people saying Black people can't get it?
No, I'm hearing it actually from Black people. That's why I'm saying that the idea that the myth then, is kind of pushed by Benjamin Rush and others, has now been something that really has, people have taken and owned. And so it was not true then. And, again, it's not true now, but again, it's really being pushed by, folk who, again, and these are not people that you would consider to be really kind of out there, folk who are really educated. And I've kind of had to argue down with some of my family members about it, who are some pastors who are still keeping churches open, largely with the conviction that, this can't impact us, in spite of what the numbers are telling us right now.
Anna, can I share two things?
Yeah.
One, I encourage you all to keep reading about the yellow fever, because the parallels with right now, obviously I'm looking at it with a particular lens, but it's terrifying. And you wonder, history learned or history not learned, and the importance of going back and reviewing those lessons. A couple of the things that, we talk about borders being open or closed. And the borders in 1790s Philadelphia were wide open. The yellow fever was coming with sick individuals off of boats from the Caribbean. There had been epidemics in the 1750s, and earlier it wasn't brand new, but we didn't have a lot of it in Philadelphia or in the northern colonies prior to the 1790s. So I think that as we talk about, do closing our international borders, will that limit coronavirus? And no, we weren't closed 50 years ago. We weren't closed 200 years ago. We weren't closed 300 years ago. And so we've always been a very interconnected world. And so that's an interesting parallel. And I'll also point our audience to a fantastic podcast that I absolutely adore called Ben Franklin's World. If you just Google that, you'll find it. And if you type in yellow fever, you'll find multiple programs. But I found two programs especially helpful. Thomas Apple has a new book a couple years old on yellow fever, and he talks about 1793 to the early 1800s. And then also Gene Abrams, who talks about founding families and medicine in this time period. And they both touch on yellow fever. So I think Thomas Apple is going to be probably the biggest, flashiest new yellow fever book. And again, Billy G. Smith, who has a book that came out a couple years ago. So there are some really thought-provoking studies on it. And again, when you look at it from what we're experiencing right now, it is absolutely eye-opening.
So I'm going to mute myself because there's a small child knocking on the door, and I'm going to let him in, and I'm going to let Abby wrap us up.
That sounds great. All right. So I was going to say thank you all so much for coming. I want to do one more quick toast, since it's a celebration of toast to all of you, to this community, to people with families.
Where's Gabriel?
Love it. To Baby Gabe. Thank you all, and please join us for future conversations. This has really been so rewarding to see all of you and take part in these conversations.
Abby, if we can, I can say on behalf of all of us, I hope this was tremendous. Great fun to get the brain a little workout. And Amy, you're as smart as I've always said, and Anna, you're as smart as I've always said, and Lauren, you're all fabulous. I'd love to have you over for a drink on the porch now, as soon as we can all get within 2 feet of each other.
Yes. Hopefully, take care, everyone.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
It's always so sad when the faces start to disappear.
I know. Thank you, everyone. And if you liked it, become a PAFA member.
Yeah, that's a great plug.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Sorry if we didn't get to you, but take care and come back for future events.
Oh,
Right.
Gabe wants to know if you have the masks ready, Amy.
I'm going to work on them this weekend now that I've finished with yellow fever.
All right. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Good night.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Eric.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye,
Mom
Eric.
again. Hi, Zara.
All right. I'm logging off too. Take care, Amy.
Bye.
Bye.